Hello, my name is Deepak Kesi. Today I'm here to talk about Nepal. I've studied economics and conflict, peace and development studies at the university back in Nepal. Currently I'm in Florida, United States, and want to talk about Nepal. It's a it lies in South Asia between India and China, and it's an amazingly ethnically diverse nation. There are more than 90 different languages spoken in Nepal, and for the size of a country that is roughly the size of the American state Georgia, that's quite something. More than 90 different mother tongues spoken, and it has three distinct geographical regions. The mountains, the hills, and the southern plains that are called Tarai in the local language. So in the mountains, you will find people of Tibeto-Burman origin. They speak Tibeto-Burman dialects, and in the hills you'll find people speaking Indo-European, Indo-Aryan languages, and also Tibeto-Burman languages. And in the southern plains called Tarai, you'll find people speaking again Indo-European, Indo-Aryan, and Tibeto-Burman languages. So it's kind of a melting pot of various civilizations. It has always been so. So the ancient history of Nepal has been recorded in various religious Hindu religious scriptures from time immemorial. They have been Nepal has always been a land of where great saints have come and meditated. It has always been this place where people from various faiths actually have come and lived together. But it has also had its fair share of ethnic tensions too, but not as ferocious as you would find in some African nations like Rwanda, where more than 800,000 people were killed in the ethnic tension between the Hutus and the Tutsis. You won't find that in Nepal, because there were so many different ethnicities. I think they kind of learned to live together as the time progressed. But that was not always the case. I mean, the modern history of Nepal begins with this one king called King Prithvi Narayan Shah. He was born in 1723 AD, almost like 50 years before the American Revolution. At that period in time, Nepal was divided into smaller kingdoms. There were more than 50 smaller kingdoms in that small area of Nepal, and one of the kingdoms was Gorkha, where King Prithvi Narayan Shah was born. It was a hilly kingdom. It was a relatively tiny kingdom with only 600 to maybe 10,000 households. That's what the kingdoms at that point in time had, basically. And the larger kingdoms had somewhere between 10,000 to 20,000 households. So he belonged to the Khas ethnicity, which is the predominant ethnicity found in Nepal, and that's the ethnicity I also happen to belong to. And when he ascended the throne at the age of 20, Kathmandu was the wealthiest kingdom in Nepal, and next to Kathmandu was Bhaktapur and Lalitpur. They were the three wealthiest kingdoms in all of entire Nepal. So Prithvi Narayan Shah always wanted to conquer Kathmandu, and he always wanted to broader his boundary. So at the age of 20, when he was made king, he he commenced his military campaign against the neighboring state of Nuwakot, but then he failed on the first attempt, and it was only in his second attempt in 1743 that he was able to conquer the neighboring state of Nuwakot, and that actually that actually is the beginning of the unification campaign of Nepal, and that actually laid the foundation of modern Nepal. And by the year 1768, Prithvi Narayan Shah, had captured Kathmandu, and he made Kathmandu the capital of the newly formed modern Nepal. So after conquering Kathmandu, went along with his military campaigns, and he actually annexed various other kingdoms, either by military campaigns or through treaties with the other kingdoms. So it is worth mentioning that during his campaigns he went along and annexed many different kingdoms where there were already various ethnicities, people of various ethnicities present in those areas. And when he annexed those kingdoms, obviously they had to live under a new rule of his of King Prithvi Narayan Shah. So that might have probably laid grounds to something that would become of a ethnic tension later in the history of Nepal. So he died in 1775. So he died at the age of 52. But then his military campaigns were carried out by his sons and other courtiers of the palace and other military commanders. But then Prithvi Narayan Shah at that time, he followed, he adopted the strategy of resistance and isolation against the British imperialist force that was present in India, the British East India Company, which was expanding its control throughout Asia and Southeast Asia, throughout South Asia, Southeast Asia. It was conquering all those kingdoms and establishing its monopoly over those territories. And Prithvi Narayan Shah, being a clever king, he was always wary of protecting Nepal's sovereignty and independence. So he actually he adopted this strategy of, like I said earlier, resistance and isolation. He fought a battle with, and not a war actually, fought a battle with the British in 1767. When the king of Kathmandu, before he was defeated by the Gorkha forces, the Prithvi Narayan's forces, he had summoned for help with the British. So the British had sent a force under the command of George Kinloch, Captain George Kinloch. But George Kinloch was defeated by the Gorkha army. He was always wary of the southern neighbor, that is British East India Company, because he knew about the strength of the British East India Company. So when he assumed power, when Prithvi Narayan Shah, he conquered Kathmandu, the first thing he did after he became king was he expelled the Christian missionaries out of Kathmandu, because there was a saying at that time, with the merchant comes the mosque, and with the Bible comes the bayonet. So he must have been influenced by that political situation at that time. So like many other kings in the Indian subcontinent, he was also wary of the British influence, and he wanted to protect his subjects and his kingdom from being occupied by the British. So that was the strategy that he adopted. And although Nepal was never formerly a part of a colonial empire, but Nepal fought a war with the British East India Company due to its military expansionist campaigns, and because Nepal was also expanding its border, and it came in clash with the British East India Company, and due to border disputes, Nepal engaged in a full frontal war with the British East India Company. Though it tried to avoid that war because it knew the Britishers were much larger in number and in strength too. But then they engaged in a war in 1814. The war lasted for 2 years, and it was in 1816 AD that the Treaty of Sugauli was signed between Nepal and the British East India Company. And due to that, as a result of that treaty, as a result of that war, the Anglo-Nepal War, Nepal lost almost 1/3 of its total land area, and that lost area is in present day India right now. So that not the war with British not only meant the end of Nepal's military expedition, but it also gave rise to an British influence in Nepali politics, and that gave rise that was the start of foreign interference in Nepali politics. Until then, Nepali politics was able to, Nepali palace was able to stay away from the foreign interference. Like I said, Prithvi Narayan Shah, he had adopted the strategy of isolation, and he had actually sealed its border to the British merchants, and he didn't allow it, the trade between the British and the Nepali merchants. So and also he had employed the strategy of resistance. But after the war, and after Nepal had succumbed to the war, Nepal was forced to allow the British to open up a residence in Nepal. So that signaled an era of political interference and meddling, and that has continued till date. When the war with the British ended, the Nepali politics was embroiled in an internal feud among the various factions inside the palace. The political situation, the internal rivalry gave rise to a political situation which was so worse that there were massacres inside the palace. And one such massacre catapulted a young military officer named Jangabahadur Rana into the post of prime minister. He was though he was only a military officer back then in 1846, but he was able to work closely with the queen and organize a massacre inside the palace, which eventually led him to become the prime minister. And that massacre also helped him, to institutionalize a family oligarchy, which lasted for 100 years. Although there were kings in the palace, but the Ranas, Jangabahadur Rana, he assumed all the power in the palace and conducted himself as the de facto ruler for the king. So the king was almost powerless inside the palace. He was almost held captive inside the palace. So all the administrative power, all the military power rested on the Ranas since then, and that lasted for 100 years, from 1846 to 1951, when Nepalese revolted against the Ranas and gained independence. The Rana regime lasted for a whole 100 years, and during that period of time, the Ranas, though they were able to protect the sovereignty of Nepal and the independence of Nepal against the British imperialist forces, but the Nepali population had to endure hardships, because the Ranas, they indulged themselves in extreme luxury and led a lavish lifestyle, whereas the common Nepalese, they faced hardships, economic hardships, and they were deprived of education. Although there were schools opened during that time between 1846 and 1951, but those were primarily for the children of the Ranas, but not for common Nepalese. So that period actually marked a dark age in the history of Nepal. That's my personal opinion, because the Nepalese were deprived of education. They couldn't educate themselves, while the whole world was embarking on on the modern education. And when in 1951 the people of Nepal revolted against the Ranas in a revolution. Through a revolution, they ousted the Rana regime. Nepal got his first elected prime minister as BP Koirala in 1959 AD, but he was ousted by King Mahendra in a royal coup in 1960 AD. So Nepal's experiment with democracy didn't last longer than 2 years, and the king imposed a partyless system that lasted for another 30 years, and it was only in 1990 that the people revolted against the monarchy, and they were able to reinstate a multi-party system in the country. But even after restoring democracy and multi-party system in 1990, people's aspirations were not met. The system of exclusion practiced against certain minorities and the regional inequality and the income inequality that existed in the Nepali society got so worse. It got so worse, in the period leading up to the 1990s, that it eventually led the Nepali society into an armed insurgency, into a civil war. Although there were development works carried out after 1990 by the democratically elected government, but those development works were primarily focused in urban areas and only benefited a certain section of population, and the people living in the far-flung areas, they were still living in abject poverty, and almost like 50% of the population were still illiterate. So that actually that worsened the socio-economic situation inside the country, and it also created a situation of economic stagnation. Because after 1990, the government liberalized the economy as a part of a global wave of globalization. Due to the globalization efforts, Nepal was also a part of that globalization effort, and Nepal was compelled to open its economy to foreign investments and foreign imports. But then that hugely impacted the industries, domestic industries that were already functioning inside the state, and due to that liberalization, many industries were closed, many domestic industries were closed, and that worsened the unemployment situation in the country. And in 1996, a communist faction called Nepal Communist Party went underground, and they declared an armed revolt against the government of Nepal, and that began that actually started the 10-year long armed conflict. The events leading to the armed conflict, the causes of the armed conflict can be traced in socio-economic injustices and grievances of indigenous population. 5 years after the Maoists had declared an armed insurgency against the government of Nepal, in 2001, King Birendra and his whole family was massacred inside the royal palace of Narayan in Kathmandu by his own son, Crown Prince Dipendra. But people were not ready to believe that somebody could kill his own father. but King Birendra's younger brother, who was later coronated, King Gyanendra. But King Gyanendra was not popular among Nepalese. In fact, his son Paras, who was later coronated crown prince, he had a history with drugs and gang violence and drunk driving, and he had apparently killed a man under the influence of alcohol. So King Gyanendra, after the royal massacre, people actually kind of lost their faith on monarchy, and that was pivotal in Nepalese history. That changed the course of history, Nepalese history forever. And in the new King Gyanendra, he was more power thirsty. So in the years following the royal massacre of 2001, King Gyanendra, after being coronated as the king, he put a ban on political parties, claiming they were inefficient and corrupt, and he assumed the total control in his own hands. So this agitated the political parties at that time and the people, and the political parties joined hands with the Maoist rebel. In 2006, people demonstrated against King Gyanendra, who had usurped power from the political parties and taken absolute control into his own hands. And the king had to bow down to the public pressure, public demonstration, and he stepped down and reinstated the parliament that he had dissolved back in 2002. So, and the same year, the rebel forces, the Nepal Communist Party, they entered into an agreement, a peace agreement with the Nepali government, formed in 2006, on the conditions of forming a constituent assembly, of electing a constituent assembly to actually write a new constitution. The period after 2006 marks a new beginning, a new chapter in the history of Nepal. And in 2008, Nepal got rid of monarchy and declared itself as a republic. And it was only in 2015 that Nepal adopted a new constitution. But there are still grievances about the new constitution, as people in a certain segment of the Nepali population demand greater autonomy and greater share in Nepali politics, and some indigenous groups, they want greater autonomy and control over the state's resources. So right now Nepal is a federal, has entered into a federal structure. So there are 7 provinces, 7 states or provinces in Nepal. So Nepal is it has come a long way from a feudal monarchy to a federal structure of government, but still there are grievances among the indigenous peoples and the marginalized populations, and Nepali state is a long way in achieving prosperity and equal distribution of resources. And although Nepal sits as one of the world's richest country in natural resources, but it has yet to explore those resources. And until those resources are explored and a strong government is put into place, the aspirations of the people will not be met.